All right.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, I guess, virtually and a recorded virtual session here. It's a pleasure to share some information with you. I wish I could be there in person or at least live, but too many things going on and too much stuff to make that happen. But glad I could be here. My name is Reid Redden, and I serve two roles for AgriLive here. One is I'm the center director, so we have our research center that's based here in San Angelo. And we also oversee some of the property in Sonora, which is a very historic research center, been there over 100 years. And then since 2015, I've served as one of the sheep and goat specialists for the state of Texas. And so, been very involved in the industry, back in Texas. I grew up here in Texas and did my graduate work outside the state and did some work up in North Dakota before coming back here. But pleasure to be here. I hope some of the information that I share today gives you a better picture of the goat industry and where things could be going from here. So in this, I'll do a little bit of an inventory where we're at, talk a bit about the markets. We do a fair amount of market reporting that we work with producers, livestock auction here in San Angelo, some general trends that are going on, not only in the markets, but just in the consumer base as well. Touch on some of the major challenges that we deal with, and I assume are some of the major challenges that you'll have there in your state as well, and maybe a little bit of an outlook at the end. So as we look at the inventory over the last 5 years or so, it's interesting that our goat industry is really kind of mimicking the sheep industry, that it's remaining fairly constant with a slight downturn. Some years it's down a little bit, some years it kind of remains stagnant. But this data comes from USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. They do this report in December. It's released at the end of the month. It may come out today, actually, but the 22 report hasn't come out. I've not seen it yet. And it generally represents the breeding stock, because the majority of the industry, especially in goats, are going to be born in the winter, spring months, and they're going to be marketed before this report comes out. So this is all goats and kids. But kids really don't represent a very large portion of the industry at that time of year. Just over 2.5 million sheep and goats. I believe it had been increasing through the years, but it topped out around the mid 2000s and have been kind of trending down. The green bars is total goats. The gray bars is the meat goat inventory, which is the biggest part of the goat industry, as you all probably very well know, just about 2 million. The only goat industry that's really increased as of recent has been the dairy goat industry, which I know very little about. And then the red bars is Angoras, just as a frame of reference. At one point in time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5, maybe as upwards of 10 million Angora goats in the state of Texas in the 50s. So at one point in time, it was a very large point of the industry, but not that way anymore. As we look at where they're located, unfortunately, these graphs haven't been updated, and I'm not tech savvy enough to pull out the data and create my own charts. So this one goes back to 2012, 10 years ago. There's probably been a little bit of shift as where the goats are located by state, but I don't think any drastic changes have occurred. The majority of the goat industry is located in Texas. We have around 750,000, maybe a bit more than that. And, Texas as a state, and I'm not trying to be proudful. I know that's a common criticism of Texans. I lived outside the state long enough that irritates people. So I'm not trying not to push that around as much, but just the reality of it, Texas has more goats than the next 10 states combined. So it is a big part of it. The reasons are generally, if you look at where they're located, it's the west kind of central part of the state. So the region by which they're located is not that much larger than other states. It's just the environment and the culture. Goats have been a part of the ranching culture in Texas. There's a lot of brush and browse, and habitat really fits them well. And so, for generations, people have been running goats primarily up until recently, and their market value has really increased. They were brush control, keeping the brush from encroaching upon a lot of the ranch lands in this region. And so it just kind of give you an idea of where they're at. Uh, this is just meat goats, and so kind of similar in structure as to where they're located. Not a lot different. Oklahoma, Tennessee, Missouri's growing in their goat numbers, and so we're seeing some of those other states popping up with the meat goats, but majority Texas still has um, a big bulk of them. But that's not true of milk goats. If we look at the dairy goat sector, they're very much in the upper Midwest. I think Wisconsin generally is up there, California. But the dairy goats they tend to follow where there's metropolitan centers and a history of dairy production. So, folks maybe had a beef cattle, I'm not beef cattle, but a dairy cattle operation. So they know dairying and they raise goats. And then a lot of them are smaller operations, and they're generally located more to where larger metropolitan is, in Texas. You got Dallas, Fort Worth, all the way down to Austin. That I-35 corridor is where the majority of those are located. As we think about the Angora goat industry, the vast majority of those, again, are in Texas and the Southwest. As of currently, there's 61,000, estimated to be 61,000 Angora goats, and that, the total in the United States is 117. The next closest state would be Arizona, and then outside of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, all the other states would combine to be around 26,000. But it's a pretty small segment. I think it's interesting to look at the reasons why people raise goats. Many of us that come from an ag production background thinks, well, you raise livestock to make money. But we also see a lot of goats in different places where that might not be true. USDA APHIS did a study back in 2012, and I doubt this has changed too much, that the number one reason people raise goats is for brush control, as the top reason. The second would be it's a fun or it's a hobby, probably show goat operations, maybe even dairy goat operations would consider themselves into that category if they're not marketing a lot of that milk or actually next level products, because I don't know of any creameries that are buying just raw dairy goat milk and taking that on. So most people that are raising that is for their own personal consumption, or they may be making some products down the line, soaps, cheeses, yogurt, things of that such. And then third, ranked on the highest, is income. So as you think about the goat industry, it helps to kind of paint the picture of why people raise them. And I think that probably goes back, if we move back a couple of slides, and I'll show you the markets in a minute, but if you're all taking part of these sessions, you're probably very aware of how the prices of meat goats have, doubled in this slide since 2017. And even before 2017, if you look 10 years before that, they've been on a steady incline, starting about 2004, when the most goat numbers, so goat prices are going up and goat numbers are going down. So that'll tell you a lot that it's not necessarily that they're just not able to sell them for enough money and they're going out of business, that there's other factors that come into play. I always say that a picture is, or you hear the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a favorite of mine. This is at the Hillingdon Ranch. It's between Comfort and Fredericksburg. And they've been running Angora goats on this ranch since the late 1800s. And it is, in my view, just a beautiful place, rolling hills, open space, a mix of oak trees and some other brush species. And in this picture here, it kind of explains why this place looks like this. And a lot of these areas now have been overtaken by cedar trees, or in this area, it would be blueberry juniper, or ash juniper, which is also called blueberry. And this little spot that that Grant Giles is standing next to used to be actually a deer exclosure. So they had a deer feeder hanging in that tree. And, of course, it would kick corn out, and you can see the deer blind on top of the hill But in a neighbor of like 25 years ago, they abandoned this deal. And so they stopped hunting on it. They took the deer feeder down, but they left the fence up. And so you can see that there's about a 20-foot cedar tree that's growing up underneath that oak tree. And the reason of that is because it's fenced off and the goats just can't get to it. So it gives you an assessment of what that total ranch would look like in the absence of goats. So they've really preserved the production value of that ranch, because other than goats, nothing else really lives off of it that we could have as an agricultural product. White-tailed deer will eat some of it, but if there's too much cedar trees, there's just not enough diversity even for them. And so in the absence of fire, goats are able to keep these landscapes open. But the challenge is a lot of places are covered up with them, and they can't resolve a problem that's gone a long time compared to having the good fortune of being managed like this place, and they never let it get out of control. And they've been doing that for almost 150 years.
So Reid, on that
Yeah.
picture, is it woven wire on there on the fence, or is it? I can
Yes.
tell from the
Yeah.
picture. At least
It's
it's
hard to
right
see
side
there,
up.
but yeah, that's a woven wire fence that's around that. And woven wire fence, fortunately, in most of the central and western part of the state is the preferred fencing type that goes up. As you leave this area, barbed wire becomes the predominant fence that people use, just the cost of putting it up. But because a diverse sheep, goats, cattle is the culture in the area, and most people are continuing to put up those woven wire fences. There's a publication that was produced by Bob Lyons and Rick Machen. There may be one other author, and I apologize for not including them here. But the publication is called "What Range Herbivores Eat and Why," and this is a chart out of that I like to use because it's very visual and easy to see. But it represents the different grazing preferences of sheep, goats, and cows. There actually is a bunch of wildlife included in this as well. So if you wanted to look at how that relates to white-tailed deer, axis deer, and I think elk and some other species in there, bison, I believe. But we generally sometimes people lump small ruminants and try to manage them like cattle, but they just don't eat the same. Of course, these charts change throughout the year, and what the palatability of these different species are and what kind of species it is. So it's a generalization, but in general, cows are going to eat in the neighborhood of 80% of their diet as grass. And doing just a little bit of eating of forbs. Forbs would be something we would call leaves, a broadleaf plant. And then browse, which would be a woody plant. So they're eating the leaves, shoots, and fruits of woody plants. A sheep will also eat the majority of its diet in grass, but they're going to selectively go after a larger portion of their diet as forbs, as weeds. And that's pretty obvious. Everyone knows that kind of sheep are weed eaters. And they will eat browse, but only about half as much browse as a goat prefers to eat. So goats that perform very well in a natural landscape generally have access to a good amount of browse. And when they don't have that access to browse, we start to see other challenges that we have to implement in our production systems to do that. And so that just gives a good visual reference of that. So, the second most common reason after brush control was fun or hobby. And in Texas, the majority of that can be kind of lumped into, show goats. Our weather goats or club goats is probably the biggest entity, and it's big business in Texas. There's we run a validation for the state, and there's a neighborhood of over 10,000 animals that are signed up to go to one of our major livestock stock shows, and that doesn't include the county shows. So it's a big chunk of goats. We do still have some Angora goat shows, that kids can participate in, and there's a pretty active dairy goat exhibition as well. But as I stated before, I know very little about the dairy goat side of things, other than they've been on the incline. This is a bars every 2 years going back to 2011. And so dairy goats, this is across the US, were around 350,000, slightly above that. In 2019, it hit its peak at about 430,000. It's come down a little bit in 21, but as a percentage of a sector of the goat industry, they've grown the most. Now we'll kind of jump into the markets here. We do some market reporting, and they only go back about 10 years. And I have this slide, and it came from Bill Thompson. He was our economist here in San Angelo, and he and I work closely on the markets, and he helps me get a lot of this together. He recently retired. We're in the process of replacing him. But I show this graph because it just illustrates the increase in the value of goats over a longer period, not in the last 5 years, but looking back even further. And so, back in 2006, 2007, the market was fairly stable. Goats are selling between $1 a pound and $1.50 a pound. And throughout the year, and I'll show you another chart in a minute, talking about the seasonal fluctuation based off of our supply, kind of goes up and down. But about 2010 is where it really started to take off. The lamb industry took off about that time. It came down, but the goat industry just kept going on up from there. So, 2006 to 2016, they went from, $1 to $1.50, upwards of, $2.50 to $3. So a pretty substantial jump. This graph here shows a little bit more current market data. The green line is 2021. And so in 2021, this is a year after COVID. Things were doing really well. The goat industry started well above $3, was approaching on average above $4.25. And then the supply started to pick up, April, May, June, July. Our market dropped down, but it barely made it back down to $3 a pound. So they're still selling pretty well. The average goat that is marketed here in San Angelo is just under 60 pounds. So just to give you a reference of what the weight is that's marketed. A lot of those what we would call cabrito used to be the goat that was most desired by the Hispanic markets here in Texas. Would be a goat that's between 10 and 15 pound carcass weight. So we're looking at a 20 to 30 pound goat. The new markets that have prevailed will take them much larger, and we'll even take adult goats at good prices as well. But that gives you a reference where we were at in 2020 or 2021, and then the dotted line is 2016 through 2020, and you see that normal trend where it's the highest in the winter months and in spring, and then it dips down in the summer when the biggest supply comes. One of the things that our ranchers are very appreciative of is it's not just the kids that are selling really well. This is nanny prices. Of course, we have bucks that come through as well, but they're not as large a volume in numbers. And so we generally just report kid goats and then the nanny prices. So if you look over a 5-year average, 2016 through 2020, that's been around $1.15 to $1.30. But that's really gone up as of recent. It's just showing a clear sign that there's a big demand for goats, and the high prices of kids have moved some of this consumer into older, bigger carcasses. The average, nanny will be somewhere around 100, 110 pounds. And they not quite doubled, but almost. So the blue bar is 2021. And it's been, just under, if you looked at the average, probably just under $2 a pound, so you're getting $200 for a cull nanny, and that's quite good. This is a research report that we put out, looking at prices from 2010 to 2018, and it has volume in here. So the blue bar is the price. The average price along that time. And so you can see it's normal trends. And then the green bar shows the volume. So if you look on the right side, so around 4,000 kids a month, between 3,000 and 4,000 in these winter months. And then as those winter and springborn kids start to show up at the market, that jumps up to around 7, sometimes 8,000 head a month. And so that volume picks up and pushes the market down. We've been presenting these reports, recently. We'll talk about some of the Eid holidays and targeting holidays. And those are kind of hit and miss depending on what the season is, how many people are gearing up for that. But one thing that is very consistent, other than 2020, which was the COVID year, everything was different then. Other than that, this seasonal trend is very predictable. If you're a data junkie and you really want to, dive into this a bit deeper, I'd encourage you to look at this this table. It's on our website. So it's at sanangelo.tamu.edu. That's our homepage. Right on our homepage, there's a picture of an auction barn. It says sheep and goat reports. So you can follow that link and find some of those other graphs that I showed before, or you can get into this one here. It's got total head, average weight, what that price was going back to 2012 for San Angelo kid goats and nannies. I will caution you though that here in 2017, and it notes this at the bottom, we started reporting all the goats instead of those that were classified as select or the top choice ones. And so you'll see an effect on the market trends. But since 2017, we've been reporting basically all of what AMS puts out. And then in closer, you can look at it by quarter. But what we produce isn't the only thing that influences the market. I put this together a few years ago for a different, state of the goat industry address or speech, and I had trouble finding some of the data that I dug out. I think it's because Bill Thompson's not here anymore to help me go through and find some of this on some of our USDA websites. But we had kind of calculated the value of the goats that are sold domestically versus imports. And so it kind of gives you a frame of reference on the consumers, how many dollars are they spending on domestically raised goats versus imported, and roughly in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the value of what consumers spend on goat meat is imported. So we don't see the imports that
Reid, you froze up.
if some of these markets, these imports, primarily Australia, New Zealand is where they're coming from. If they can ramp up production of goats, they're very good at sheep farming, but goat farming is a little bit different. To my understanding, the vast majority of goat meat that's imported in the US are pretty much feral goats that are being gathered and caught. And so with anything that you don't manage and you're just catching, there's a point where it becomes harder and harder to find those, and those populations go down. So until a large scale farming entity of goats comes about, or the worldwide demand for those and what the rest of the world wants in volume and price, we have to be determined how these continue to influence the markets here. Like sheep, they're basically half the value. And so again, this is a little bit dated. I apologize for that. My ability to grab this data is limited. And so on this one, we do San Angelo live price. So notice live price versus carcass price. So this is from 2010 to 2018. The live price is pretty close to what the imports is, but the imports are carcass price. So, obviously we have, half the weight in a live animal versus a carcass plus processing costs. And so since these are fairly close, it gives you a pretty good indication that they're being marketed at about half the value. And so we're fortunate to have a domestic consumer that's willing to pay a pretty large premium. Probably not that important for your area to do much on US mohair production and prices, but this is a historical chart just kind of showing when the biggest chunk of mohair was produced and what the prices were. In the early 90s is when the Wool and Mohair Incentive Act went away, and that really devastated the Angora goat industry. The prices were down, but there was an incentive act that was keeping them going. When that went away, the numbers fell. The prices have come back. If you look at the sheep and goat report on NASS, it says that the average mohair sold is about $6. You'll hear people talk. They're selling kid hair for, $15 to $18 a pound, and adult hair from, 8 to 12, depending on the markets. And so those may be a little bit different, whereas the USDA report kind of takes all of it. So, if there was defect in the hair or all the off sorts and everything comes around. So it's around $6, which is a lot higher than it has been. But it's probably not the point that we're going to see any major expansion in that sector of the goat industry. Those that are in it are benefiting from it. They'll continue to be in it, but it's unlikely that we're going to see a bunch of people move into it to capitalize on that. Here's that chart from 2011 to 2019 on mohair prices. They're on the incline, but raising Angora goats takes an art to manage them. So let's talk a little bit about consumers. This was put together several years ago, but I really like it. It kind of gives a worldwide consumer outlook. And so this is sheep and goat meat that's consumed annually, and the top 20 countries. So, China is the biggest consumer of sheep and goat meat, followed by Mongolia. Then we have India, Iran, Nigeria, Pakistan, United Kingdom. And you see us at the US, way down here at 357 million pounds. And I think it's interesting to look at these countries and where we see a lot of people that are immigrating into the United States. And a lot of these areas where they come from, they eat a lot of sheep and goat meat. And so they bring those values with them. Now, this is the same data set, but it's divided by population. So this is per person, pounds of intake of sheep and goat meat. So China was the biggest one before. And per unit population, they still eat quite a bit more than the United States at 6 pounds per person. But if you want someone to immigrate and be your neighbor, the ones you want are Mongolians, because they eat almost 90 pounds of sheep and goat meat per person per year. So big consumers. Even in India, which is primarily a vegetarian country, they still, across the population, those that do eat sheep and goat meat is about 1 pound per year. Iran, 15 pounds per person per year. Nigeria, Pakistan, United Kingdom, most of that's going to be lamb. Turkey, Australia. And so, I'm sure y'all have access to this slide set, but you can kind of go back and look at it and think about as these countries, Syria, these folks move into the United States, a lot of times they're going to bring that culture and what they eat with them. The biggest consumer of both sheep and goat in the non-traditional markets are generally going to be of the Muslim faith. This data is for lamb. Unfortunately, doesn't exist for goat. And I don't know that it's a one-to-one comparison, but it's similar. It has some similar trends. For lamb, Jewish, I'm not sure that that's the same for goats. And then Christians that would eat it weekly. So we're looking for a very routine consumer. That's the populations that are going to be consuming those. And then this is just an older figure. What percentage of the population are Muslims? And Muslims tend to be the ones that are our larger non-traditional consumers, and what countries those are coming from. So you can kind of take a brief look at it, but Northern Africa, the Middle East, those are large Muslim populated countries, and we have a number of those moving into the United States. When we look in the United States, the Muslim population within each state, the darker colors would be higher populations. So California, Illinois, New York are in the neighborhood of almost 1%, not quite there, but from a half to upwards of 1, they may be at that point by this time. I can't remember exactly when I pulled this chart off. But even in Texas, which we don't think about it, but our huge metropolitan centers, 0.2 to 0.3% of the population are Muslims. When you're spreading that across nearly 30 million people, it's a fairly large population of folks that are consuming those. And, the Pew Research Center is suggesting that that's going to be ever increasing. So especially, Muslims, we're expecting to be at 1% by 2015. I think this data actually comes back from 2010, but by 2050 at 2% of the population. And so basically, looking at doubling the number of those consumers as long as they continue to follow those same eating patterns. So I'm sure if you're involved in the sheep and goat industry, you're aware of the Eid holidays and other religious holidays that influence, um, these bigger spikes in demand. This chart comes from sheepandgoat.com / ethnic calendar. I think it's important to look at that because they don't follow our calendar, and these are moving targets. And so the one that I'd draw your attention to, we've circled here. This is Ramadan, and then the festival of fast breaking, which is the end of Ramadan, a month of fasting. So, the adult population are not eating or drinking during the day, but there tends to be some eating of lamb before and maybe even at night. If you don't eat all day, you want to eat something good in the evenings. And then definitely when Ramadan's over, there's a 3-day festival afterwards. So here in 21, Ramadan starts April 12th and will end May 12th. And so we will see a definite increase in the number of volume of those animals moving into that market. But that's also, we're in our peak production season. So especially here in Texas, these are the months where we're really ramping up, especially for lambs and hair sheep. They tend to be born a bit earlier and they grow a bit faster. So we shouldn't have too much of a problem supplying that market. And across the US, we shouldn't have problems supplying that. Goats may be a little bit more stretched. They tend to be a bit more seasonal, kidding a bit later in the spring. And so they might be young and light at that time. And then July 20th through the 23rd is the Festival of Sacrifice. This tends to be older, larger animals that are desired by the market. And then if you look, into the future, that's moving up 10 days to weeks. So, here in, 5 to 10 years, as that market moves into the winter, when we're really short on supply, it's probably going to have a bigger impact, and those, fall lambing, fall kidding operations stand the most to gain. All right. So that's the consumer. A little bit about trends on landowners and producers. I might encourage you to go read a publication called Livestock for Small Acreage Landowners. Again, another one written by Rick Machin and Bob Lyons. It has some date to it, but good publications can kind of stand the test of time, talking about livestock production and how acreages get smaller and smaller over time. This better fits some of our small ruminants or smaller animal. It's easier to have a male around whenever you only have 1 or 2 animal units that can be managed on your property. And so small ruminants fit into the smaller acreage landowners. And, when I was preparing for this presentation, I went and looked, and there's roughly 2.5 million goats, and USDA estimates there's 136,000 goat owners. And so if you just divide it out, the average goat owner only has about 17 goats. So you see that these land trends and what was being predicted when that was written well over 10 years ago is definitely coming true. So, if you're gonna jump into the goat industry, there's some major challenges that have been around. They continue to be around. One of the biggest ones is parasites, particularly internal parasites. Managing goats and internal parasites is something that everybody that has goats should be on the top of their mind. A great resource. There's 2 websites. One's called wormboss.com.au. Mostly for sheep, but there's some goat stuff. That's where I grabbed this chart that shows the life cycle of internal parasites. If you own goats and are farming goats, I encourage you to learn that life cycle and understand it, because it will definitely help you in your management. I'm not going to go through it. I don't think we have near enough time to try to jump deep dive into internal parasites, but really focus on, when you're using dewormers, be selective about what products you're using. Probably need to be using combination products, multiple active ingredients at one time. Make sure they're from two different classes. um, Folks here in Texas have really seen a benefit from using copper oxide wire particle boluses for both sheep and goats in conjunction with a dewormer. But they're trying to be selective about it, only treating those animals at high risk at certain times and maybe not treating the whole herd. Just treating those that have symptoms if you have that management ability, and doing some level of refugia, and definitely timing, watching fecal egg counts, and treating when that parasite season's coming on. If we try to prescriptive, create a prescription and treat these animals at this time and this number of repeated doses over a period of time, you will develop resistance and it will become a major challenge for you in the future. Genetics is something to be aware of as well. Generally, people run to what breed is the best for this. Um, there are some goat breeds. I think the Spanish is Spanish myotonics, Kikos are known for a bit better internal parasite resistance, but none of them are going to have a really high level of parasite resistance that you might see in some of the highly selected sheep breeds. It's important to cull those animals that are repeatedly need to be treated because they're not only propagating genetics that become a problem, but they're also the ones that are contaminating pastures the most. FAMACHA scoring, encourage you to watch some videos, learn how to do that. Sometimes knowing exactly that push pull pop technique where you cover the eyelid, pull the lower eyelid, that third eyelid pops out, that membrane actually pops out, and you're scoring that appropriately, using that in your management. Doing these fecal egg counts, whether that's monitoring the seasonal patterns of parasites or doing, your entire kid crop, doing a fecal egg count on all of those and making genetic selections. And then also the meat goat industry has the ability to generate estimated breeding values similar to the sheep industry using the same program. And there's clear evidence that if we'll use a sophisticated quantitative genetics program for internal parasite resistance, it can mean a lot. And so although there's just not a lot of goat seed stock breeders out there that are using that technology, and if you're really wanting to grow a big segment of the industry, I'd encourage you to look into that. Some other general best management practices. We know full well the animals that are in low body condition during these parasite seasons are the ones that are targeted by the parasites because they don't have the immunological ability to shut them down. They're not getting enough protein generally during lactation, so some additional protein supplementation helps there. And then of course, manage your grazing. Rotating pastures, just trying to where they're not constantly re-eating dirty pastures, getting that rotation, moving into high browse pastures during our highest parasite risk season, and pulling the plug at certain points in time and just going to a dry lot where that internal parasite can't complete its life cycle. Maybe a management strategy that works for you. Of course, another big challenge is our predators, the coyotes, the biggest challenge that we have, and I would assume would probably be fairly similar for your region. And it's not going away anytime soon. We can try to fence them out with a good net wire fence, although those are very expensive to put up. But they don't stop predators completely, but they can allow you to slow them down. They can improve your guardian animals and improve your trapping ability. Electric fence, if you have enough hot wires and it's hot enough, it can dissuade predators as well. So, one or two strands probably not going to do it, but a 5 to 7 strand electric fence can do a decent job of slowing down some of our ground-based predators. And with good fencing, it improves our ability to manage guardian animals. Livestock guard dogs tend to be the best guardian tool that's out there, but they're also the highest management. They don't always stay where they're supposed to. Getting them bonded and trained, you got to feed them. So it's a big challenge. We have a livestock guardian dog outreach and research program. We manage, over 24 dogs on our research property. So I very well know the challenge that can be with managing these on large landscapes. Donkeys and llamas are a much easier tool, and in certain settings can do the job, but they may not have as refined of the abilities as a guard dog. You kind of fighting fire with fire tends to be a better approach, but when they do work, they are a much easier tool. The challenge with them is if one donkey or one llama is not enough, and you keep adding more, they tend to make their own herd and don't stay with your sheep and goats as well. And then, H2A herders or a year-round shepherd, or just the constant presence of you as the principal, operator is very good at helping manage our predators. And of course, lethal options should be in place if we can't stop predation. Hunting, we don't have a whole lot of success here in Texas with calling. The coyotes have been fairly well trained to calling, unless you're just a real phenomenal caller and hunter on that. You're not going to have a ton of success. You may better it there with a little bit more open landscape, but the vast majority of our coyotes are generally taken, on the sheep and goat country through a helicopter. So aerial support, whether that's with USDA Wildlife Services or with a private entity. We do have a checkoff program in Texas for predator control. And so there's a sheep and goat predator board, and they do assist the industry. And one of the assistance programs is helping out with aerial support. Snares tends to be the best tool against coyotes. Of course, we have a number of other predators, bobcats, the feral hogs populations exploded. We really don't have a great handle on how impactful they are. The survey data doesn't show much, but they eat everything. So it's hard to confirm you had a feral pig issue whenever everything's gone. You really don't find any evidence that they were there or that they preyed upon your lambs and kids. We really don't have the toxicants that we used to. You do have the M44s or the cyanide guns that a approved person can use. And so there's a number of tools out there. None of them are a silver bullet. Try to use all that you can to keep your predators in check. One of the underlying challenges that the small ruminant industry faces, and I assume that you're dealing with the same issues in your area, but just the land value. We see a major shift in who our landowners are due to the land value. This chart goes back to 2017. It's done nothing but go up from there. When we look at dollars per acre averaged across Texas rural lands, we're over $2,500 an acre. In our region of San Angelo, we needed, in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 acres per sheep or goat to manage them throughout the year without a lot of supplementation. Of course, supplementation, dry lot, improved pasture, doing some farming and growing some forage can increase our stocking rate. But just the simple math, if you needed 10 acres per goat in a more arid place, that's $25,000 to invest in a goat, and they're just not going to pay enough. It's going to be more like a 1% return on investment in your land. Obviously the land value is going up, but now we're talking about a real estate investment, not a land purchase, because it's just so segregated from land values being based on agricultural production. So it's difficult for people to get in the industry, and those that have that land, there's a big opportunity for them to sell that, invest that somewhere else, or just go in a different direction. So that's a challenge and I'm not sure how the industry is going to play out in the future due to that major challenge. So in kind of a summary, looking at the goat industry as a whole, we definitely have demand outpacing supply. We're not seeing a rapid increase in supply. nor are we seeing major increases in imported product to meet this demand. That's goat meat, goat milk. Resource management may be something where the goat industry can expand, where we're doing prescriptive grazing, prescriptive brush control for other landowners, even at a fee. So not only are we benefiting from marketing the goats, but marketing the value of having them on landscapes. We're seeing that, growing population of consumers, that's very clear. Um, Shrinking supply. Maybe supply is growing, we're just not measuring it. But if it is, it's pretty small in relation to what the demand is. Some of the major challenges aren't changing: parasites, predators, land costs, and all of those relate to kind of a high startup cost and a high cost of operation going forward. So it's positive things, but there's definitely some things that we'll have to address. Again, I wish I was there in person to take questions, but maybe Dwayne has some good ones for me here, and we can try to answer before we wrap this up.
So where do you see the price going in the next 5 years?
I'm not an economist. I just watch these markets as close as I can. They always say the cure for high prices are high prices. So, I think what we saw in 21 is they got really high. As soon as the supply picked up, the markets really kind of started to fall off. So I would estimate we're on the upper end for what the consumers are willing to buy and then rebuy and then rebuy again. You see them moving into the adult goat meat trade because of the high cost. So could it go up? Yeah, I would be more likely that it's going to stabilize or go down some. I don't see a major crash coming, but there could likely be some readjustment. But you look at them in relation to an animal unit, their gross returns are just astronomical compared to, you could run, the books say 6 goats per cow, but in reality you could probably run 10 goats per cow on the same animal unit basis, or you could probably run 2 to 3 goats per cow without adding any new resources to it. So I'm distracted away from your original question, but I would say, maintenance to maybe a slight pullback. But
Do you think inventory will continue to grow?
history doesn't suggest that. And if you kind of dig into the statistics and look at how long people stay in the goat industry, it's exciting when you look at maybe 30% of the people that own goats have had them less than 5 years. But I've been doing this extension stuff for well over 10 years, and that's not changed. So a lot of those that get in don't stay in. Goats are a real challenge to manage, and I think a lot of it is probably smaller acreage stuff. But even our larger farming units, keeping them around, just fighting predators. People get weary of fighting predators and they just give it up, or they get in a position where parasites just are wearing them out if they're primarily grass based, and so they don't stay in. So I don't see supply. If it does go up, it won't meet demand still.
All righty.
What are you seeing in goat numbers in your area?
I think we're seeing a lot more smaller producers, just kind of like you said, and it's been pretty stable though. Just a few here and there, and some people getting out, other people getting in. It's kind
Yeah,
of rotating, at least from what I've seen in our area.
yeah. Some of our larger goat producers, I mean, I hear a lot that they're putting trailer loads and semi loads of replacement nannies, and they're going north, um, into into the Midwest. But I just don't know
I think we
how
see
sustainable
more.
some of those places are going.
Yeah,
One of the good ways to be in a disaster is not raise goats and then buy several hundred of them.
yeah. And I think a lot of them are going to eastern Kansas more so because there's a lot more brush there.
Yeah. So, well, all right. Well, hopefully that was some information that can be a benefit to you all. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.